All right, let's set the scene. The date is August 23rd, 2001. We're looking at Air Transat Flight 236, which is an Airbus A330 prepped and ready on the tarmac at Toronto Pearson Airport, destined for Lisbon. It's a standard 7-hour nonstop journey. The tanks are loaded up with a massive 48 metric tons of fuel. Up in the cockpit, we've got a highly experienced duo. Captain Robert Pichet is 48 years old with a staggering 16,000 hours of flight experience. Sitting alongside him is 28-year-old First Officer Dirk de Jager, bringing 5,000 flight hours of his own to the table, including 400 specifically on this A330 model. By all accounts, it's an ordinary night, perfect flying conditions, and they're in a state-of-the-art aircraft that's only 2 years old.
But this completely ordinary flight is about to turn into an incredibly desperate fight for survival. I want you to imagine this. You've got 293 passengers, mostly fast asleep, cruising comfortably at 39,000 feet over the pitch-black, freezing waters of the mid-Atlantic Ocean. And within just a few hours, they're going to be facing the absolute most terrifying reality imaginable in aviation. They'll be staring down at an empty fuel gauge with absolutely nowhere to land. For the first 4 hours after their 9 p.m. takeoff, it's just smooth sailing. Within minutes, the aircraft reaches its cruising altitude of 39,000 feet. Now, on these long-haul flights, the autopilot does a lot of the heavy lifting, right? The pilots are mainly monitoring the situation and checking in with air traffic control. But then, at exactly 1 a.m. Canadian time, smack in the dead center of the Atlantic Ocean, the very first anomaly strikes. And what's truly bizarre here is the nature of these sudden sensor readings. The right engine, engine number 2, throws a very strange error. It's showing high oil pressure, low oil quantity, and, crucially, a low oil temperature. This makes zero logical sense. Normally, during operation, oil temperature rises. A low reading in this context was something neither pilot had ever seen in their entire careers. They immediately check the flight manual. Nothing. They radio the Air Transat maintenance unit back in Canada. Astonishingly, the maintenance unit doesn't know what it means either. They essentially tell the pilots, well, just keep monitoring it, assuming it might just be a faulty sensor playing tricks on them. Fast forward half an hour, and the plot really thickens. A new advisory message pops up, and this one isn't about oil, it's about fuel. Commercial aircraft distribute their fuel equally across both wings, but suddenly a fuel imbalance is detected. The right wing had significantly less fuel than the left. Now look, in isolation, a fuel imbalance isn't some massive emergency. It's an issue that pilots routinely fix mid-flight all the time. But in the context of this explainer, you'll see how it was the trigger for a devastating sequence of events. So the crucial takeaway here is how standard, by-the-book procedures can sometimes completely backfire. To fix the imbalance, Captain Pichet initiates the standard cross-feed procedure. He opens the valve to allow fuel to transfer from the heavier left wing into the lighter right wing. Within minutes, the fuel levels equalize. Problem solved, right? Actually, scratch that. It was a tragic irony. Because there wasn't a sensor error at all. There was a massive, unseen leak in that right wing. By opening that valve, the captain had inadvertently pumped their perfectly good remaining fuel directly out of the bleeding right wing and into the open sky. Just 10 minutes later, the low fuel warning alarms start blaring. The right wing is nearly empty again, and now the pilots realize the horrifying truth. They don't even have enough combined fuel to reach Lisbon. They have exactly 7 tons, or 7,000 kilograms of fuel remaining. To put the sheer panic of that math into perspective, 7 tons is a measly 6% of their total capacity. Worse, they're bleeding fuel at an astonishing rate of 1 ton every 5 minutes. The captain immediately radios Santa Maria Air Traffic Control to urgently divert to Lodges Airport on Terceira Island in the Azores. As they're desperately racing toward the island, the maintenance unit radios them with a very specific instruction: drop to 20,000 feet to visually confirm the leak. Now, Captain Pichet flat out refuses. Why? Because his gut instinct told him that if the leak was real, dropping altitude meant they could never climb back up. Maintaining that 39,000-foot altitude was the single brilliant decision that preserved their potential glide distance. It literally saved their lives. And his instinct was dead right. The situation escalates violently. The right engine suddenly catches fire and completely dies. The cabin, which was previously fast asleep, is thrown into absolute terror. The pilots are now 240 kilometers away from Lodges Airport, flying on just a single engine with a terrifyingly low 4.5 tons of fuel left. And because they're relying solely on that left engine, it has to be pushed to full thrust just to keep them in the air, which, you guessed it, only burns their remaining fuel even faster. Then comes the absolute gut punch. With only 600 kilograms of fuel left in the tanks and still 120 kilometers away from the airport, the overworked left engine finally burns out. It just sputters and dies. This massive, state-of-the-art Airbus A330 is now completely dead on the sky. Zero engines, zero power. Pitch black. The very second both engines died, the entire electrical system of the aircraft shut down. The cabin went completely dark, plunging the 293 passengers into a horrifying pin-drop silence. Without engines, a 300-ton commercial airliner essentially becomes a massive metal brick plummeting toward the ocean. They begin dropping at a terrifying rate of 2,000 feet per minute.
So, how do you even steer a dead plane? The answer is their absolute last lifeline, the RAT, or ram air turbine. This tiny, automatically deployed propeller pops right out of the belly of the plane. It uses the sheer force of the passing airspeed to spin and generate just enough emergency electricity to power the most critical cockpit instruments. Without this ingenious little device, those pilots would have been flying completely blind in the dark. But even with the instruments back online, the reality was incredibly grim. They were still really far from the airport, dropping fast. The crew had to begin prepping the cabin for a water landing. And let's be incredibly clear here. Ditching a commercial plane in the open Atlantic is almost always a fatal last resort. Even if passengers somehow survive the massive impact forces, the likelihood of drowning or succumbing to rapid hypothermia in the freezing water is unbelievably high. It was, quite literally, a life or death countdown. But against all odds, guided purely by Pichet's manual stick controls, the massive glider makes it to within 15 kilometers of the runway at Terceira Island. But this brings up a massive new question. How do you actually land a plane without engines? Because without thrust, you have zero margin for error. You can't just circle around and try again. It's a one-shot deal. And here was their final, terrifying obstacle. At 15 kilometers out, a plane is supposed to be at a safe approach altitude of 3,000 feet. Flight 236 was up at 13,000 feet. If Captain Pichet simply pointed the nose down to reach the runway, the heavy aircraft would build up lethal, uncontrollable speed, pretty much guaranteeing a fiery crash the second they touched the tarmac. So the crucial point is how they bled off that altitude without power. It was an absolute masterclass in physics and aviation skill. First, Pichet executed a full 360-degree turn in the sky. By the time they completed the circle, they had dropped to 5,000 feet. Still slightly too high, he then steered the plane into a series of S-turns to artificially increase their flight distance and bleed off the remaining height. Remember, he had no flops to create drag to slow them down, and no engine thrust to lift the nose up during the final landing flare to soften the impact. The balance had to be completely perfect. And they made it. The plane slammed onto the runway with a massive, violent jolt. The impact was so severe that 8 of the 12 landing gear tires instantly exploded. The plane skidded aggressively down the tarmac, sparking a huge fire in the landing gear, but incredibly, it shuddered to a safe halt. Airport emergency crews immediately extinguished the flames. Every single one of the 293 passengers and 13 crew members survived the ordeal. What these pilots accomplished that night cemented Flight 236 forever in aviation history. They successfully executed the longest unpowered glide of a commercial passenger airliner ever recorded. A 300-ton metal tube completely dead in the sky, brought down safely against all conceivable odds. It's just phenomenal. Now, what's truly fascinating is the sheer mundanity of what almost killed 306 people. The official investigation revealed it all started back on the ground in Toronto. A maintenance crew had replaced an engine part, but they incorrectly installed a part meant for an older engine model. This slight mismatch resulted in a loose fitting. In flight, this caused intense vibrations, which eventually rubbed against and completely ruptured a high-pressure hydraulic fuel line. A tiny human error on the ground snowballed into a catastrophic leak at 39,000 feet. Following the investigation, Airbus actually installed new systems to help pilots identify fuel leaks much more clearly during flight. And rightfully so. 1 year later, Captain Robert Pichet and First Officer Dirk de Jager were honored with the Superior Airmanship Award for pulling off what experts call an impossible dead stick landing. Which leaves us with this final thought to wrap up this explainer. In an era where state-of-the-art computers essentially fly our planes, when that technology completely fails in the pitch-black dead of night, is sheer human instinct our ultimate safety system?
Captain Pichet's defiance of the maintenance manual and his brilliant physical maneuvering say yes. It's a remarkable balance between complex machinery and human ingenuity. Keep this incredible story in mind next time you fly.